An Amish man took 30 lashes for a runaway woman. The whip cracked again and again across his back, yet he stood silent, blood soaking his shirt while the crowd held its breath. By dawn, she was free, but he was broken. And then the very next day, her family thundered into town with a shocking demand. Not gratitude, not mercy. A proposal that would bind them together forever. But beneath the dust and prayers lies a darker truth. This runaway woman carries a secret that could shatter him, and her family's enemies are already circling like wolves. What happens when sacrifice meets scandal? When honor is forced into a marriage built on shame? And will the man who bled for her find love or only betrayal? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The morning sun cast long shadows across San Miguel's dusty Main Street as Donald Stoltzfus worked in his carpenter's shop. The familiar scent of fresh-cut pine and wood shavings filled the air as he carefully sanded the curved leg of a rocking chair. His calloused hands moved with practiced precision, checking the smoothness with gentle strokes. The quiet rhythm of his work shattered as shouts erupted from the street. Donald set down his tools, a knot forming in his stomach. Such commotion rarely meant anything good in their small rail town. He stepped to the workshop door, wiping sawdust from his plain black vest. A crowd had gathered in front of the marshal's office, their bodies tense with anticipation. Through the press of people, Donald spotted Marshal Jenkins dragging a young woman by the arm toward the square's wooden post. His heart sank as he recognized Amanda Wainwright, daughter of the prominent rancher whose spread lay just outside town. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and her dress was stained with trail dust. Fear showed plain on her face, though she held her head high. "This here woman has brought disgrace upon a respectable family," Marshal Jenkins announced, his voice carrying across the square. 30 lashes'll teach her to mind her place and her father's wishes. Donald's hands trembled slightly. The sight of the whip in the marshal's grip brought back memories of his own disgrace among the Amish, how they'd turned their backs when he refused to bear arms in the war. He'd carried that shame westward, seeking a new start. But watching Amanda's shoulders shake as they tied her hands, something stronger than shame stirred in his heart. The still small voice that had led him to lay down arms now urged him forward. "Wait!" Donald's quiet word cut through the murmuring crowd. Boots scraped on wooden planks as townspeople turned to stare at the normally reserved carpenter. He walked steadily toward the post, removing his black coat as he went. "I'll take her punishment." "This ain't your business, Stoltzfus," Marshal Jenkins growled. "The girl's earned her lashing fair and square. Nevertheless." Donald folded his coat carefully, laying it aside. "I'll bear it in her place." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Amanda's eyes went wide as Donald gently moved her aside and presented his back to the post. His plain white shirt gleamed in the morning sun. The marshal spat in the dust. "Suit yourself, carpenter. 30 lashes it is." Donald pressed his forehead against the rough wood, closing his eyes. As the first crack of the whip split the air, he silently recited the words that had guided him through war and exile. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." The lash bit deep. Donald's fingers dug into the post, but he didn't cry out. Again and again the whip fell, each stroke laying fire across his back. Through the haze of pain, he was aware of Amanda's quiet weeping, of the crowd's stunned silence dot by the 10th lash. His shirt hung in bloodied strips. Still, Donald held fast to his scripture, letting the familiar words carry him through each burning stroke. "Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake." The 30th lash fell. Donald sagged against the post, feeling warm blood trickle down his back. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Amanda stepped forward, her hands gentle as she helped him stand. The crowd parted silently as Donald retrieved his coat. He couldn't quite straighten, but he managed to walk with steady steps back toward his workshop. Behind him, shocked whispers filled the square, spreading the tale of the quiet carpenter who'd taken another's punishment without a sound. Amanda followed close behind, her face streaked with tears. As they reached the workshop door, she touched his arm. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know me." Donald turned carefully, meeting her eyes. "Because no child of God deserves the lash," he said simply. "And sometimes mercy must wear flesh to be truly seen." The morning sun streamed through the workshop windows, catching the floating motes of sawdust in golden light. Donald's unfinished chair sat waiting, its newly smoothed leg, testament to work interrupted by an act of sacrificial grace that would ripple through San Miguel like wind across prairie grass. The crowd slowly scattered into the morning heat, leaving whispered conversations in their wake. Reverend Thomas hurried forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Brother Stoltzfus cannot walk home in this condition," he declared, gesturing to two young men from his congregation. "Help me carry him to the church." Donald tried to protest, but his legs betrayed him, buckling as he attempted to stand straight. The men caught him gently under each arm, supporting his weight as they guided him toward the simple wooden church at the end of the street. Amanda followed close behind, wringing her hands in her skirts. Her face was pale, but determination had replaced the earlier fear in her eyes. As they settled Donald face down on a wooden table, she stepped forward. "I'll tend to his wounds," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Child, you don't have to." Reverend Thomas began, but Amanda cut him off. "Please," she insisted, "I must." The Reverend studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The kitchen's through there. You'll find clean linens in the bottom drawer." Amanda moved quickly, lighting the iron stove and setting a pot of water to boil. Her hands shook as she gathered supplies: clean cloths, a basin, the precious bar of soap the church ladies used for communion dishes. The familiar tasks helped steady her nerves, though her heart still raced at the thought of the stranger's sacrifice. Working carefully, she cut away what remained of Donald's bloodied shirt. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his ravaged back. Amanda bit her lip, fighting back tears as she dipped a cloth in the warm water and began cleaning away the dried blood. Donald flinched at her first touch but made no sound. After a few moments, he spoke softly. "The Lord's hand is gentle, even when the path is hard." Amanda's hands stilled. "I never asked you to do this," she blurted, her voice thick with shame. "You had no cause to step forward, no cause at all." "Some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone," Donald replied, his words muffled against his folded arms. "No soul stands beyond God's mercy, child. Not yours, not mine." Tears splashed onto her hands as she worked, carefully cleaning each wound. The steady rhythm of Donald's breathing and the soft crackle of the lamp flame filled the quiet kitchen. Outside, a mountain wind whistled through the eaves, making the church timbers creak and settle. As midnight approached, Donald stirred, trying to push himself upright. "I should return to my shop." His arms trembled, and he nearly toppled from the table. Amanda caught his shoulders, steadying him. "You'll do no such thing," she scolded gently, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "You can barely stand." Reverend Thomas appeared in the doorway, carrying blankets and a folding cot. "You'll stay here tonight, Brother Stoltzfus." No argument. Donald shook his head weakly. "The bench will do fine," he murmured. "Been sleeping rough since leaving Pennsylvania. Don't need special treatment now." Amanda helped him settle onto the long wooden pew, arranging the blankets carefully to avoid putting pressure on his wounds. The Reverend banked the stove for the night and retreated to his small room off the sanctuary, leaving Amanda alone with her thoughts. She sank down near the hearth, drawing her shawl tight around her shoulders. The events of the day felt almost unreal in the flickering shadows. This quiet stranger had stepped forward to bear her punishment without hesitation, had spoken words of grace instead of condemnation. Such kindness was foreign to her recent experience, as foreign as the peace that seemed to radiate from him, even in his pain. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, unsure if Donald was still awake to hear. The only answer was the soft whisper of his breathing and the lonely song of the wind in the church rafters. The night deepened around them, broken only by the occasional pop of settling wood and the distant cry of a coyote. Amanda curled closer to the dying embers, her mind full of questions she dared not voice. In the morning, she knew she would have to face the consequences of her choices again. But for now, in this sanctuary of lamplight and shadow, she allowed herself to rest in the presence of a mercy she had never thought to find. Morning light streamed through the church's stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the worn floorboards. Donald stirred on the hard bench, every movement sending fresh waves of pain across his lacerated back. He gripped the pew's edge, trying to push himself upright without showing how much it hurt. Amanda had already been up for hours, stoking the iron stove to life. The rich aroma of coffee filled the small kitchen area. She moved quietly, her skirts rustling as she poured the dark liquid into a tin cup. Her eyes were ringed with shadows that spoke of a sleepless night. "You should drink something," she murmured, placing the cup before Donald. Steam curled up in the cool morning air. Before Donald could reach for it, the thunder of approaching hooves split the quiet. Amanda's head snapped up, her face draining of color. "No," she whispered, "not yet." The church door burst open, crashing against the wall. Silas Wainwright strode in, his boots leaving muddy prints on the clean floor. Behind him came Ruth, his wife, her face tight with worry, and Amanda's two brothers, their expressions dark with family shame. "There you are, girl," Silas spat, his voice cutting through the sacred stillness. His gaze swept over Donald, taking in the blood-stained bandages visible through his torn shirt. "So it's true. You spent the night here with this stranger." "Reverend." Thomas hurried forward from his study. "Now, Brother Wainwright, nothing improper. Silence." Silas's command echoed off the rafters. Several townspeople, drawn by the commotion, gathered in the doorway. "My daughter has brought disgrace to the Wainwright name. First by running from her promised match, now by this scandal." Ruth touched her husband's arm. "Silas, please," he shrugged her off, but something shifted in his face. A calculated look replaced the rage. "However," he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "there may yet be a way to salvage this situation." Amanda took a step backward, her shoulders hitting the wall. She knew that tone. It always preceded her father's most immovable decisions. "You," Silas pointed at Donald, who had managed to stand, one hand braced against the pew. "You chose to involve yourself in my family's business. Now you'll see it through properly." He straightened to his full height. "You will marry my daughter. Today. Now. Or she will be cut off entirely. No inheritance, no family name, no protection." A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Amanda's voice cracked through the silence. "Father, no! You can't. I can and I will." Silas's words fell like hammer blows. "The choice is simple. Marriage or complete disownment. Which will it be?" Donald stared at the floorboards, his mind churning. His Amish upbringing rang clear in his thoughts. Marriage was sacred, not to be rushed into for convenience or compulsion. Yet he could feel Amanda trembling across the room, could sense the fear radiating from her. To refuse would leave her destitute, abandoned by all who should protect her. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should take some time to—" "There will be no delay," Silas cut in. "Decide now, Carpenter." Donald lifted his head slowly, looking first at Amanda. Her eyes were wide, a mix of gratitude and terror in their depths. Then he studied Silas's stern face, Ruth's pleading expression, the brothers' barely contained anger. Finally, he met the Reverend's concerned gaze. "I will marry her," he said quietly, his Pennsylvania Dutch accent more pronounced in his weariness. "Not because you command it, Mr. Wainwright, but because it's right to offer protection when it's needed." Amanda's hand flew to her throat, her fingers working nervously at her collar. Relief and fear warred across her features as she realized what this stranger's vow would mean. Safety from her father's wrath, but a life bound to a man she barely knew. Silas nodded sharply. "Reverend, proceed with the ceremony. Now, before any more shame can attach itself to my family's good name." Ruth moved to Amanda's side, smoothing her daughter's tangled hair with trembling fingers. "At least let me help her prepare. Marry as she is," Silas declared. "Let the state of her serve as a reminder of her choices." The morning sun continued to pour through the stained glass, casting holy colors across this unholy bargain. Donald stood as straight as his injuries would allow, his quiet strength a contrast to Silas's bristling authority. Amanda stepped forward, on shaking legs to take her place beside him, their shadows merging on the sun-warmed floorboards. The townsfolk pressed closer, eager to witness this unexpected turn of events. Reverend Thomas opened his Bible with reluctance, searching Amanda's face one last time for any sign she would protest. Finding only resigned acceptance, he began to read the familiar words that would bind these two strangers together in the eyes of God and man. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky as the townsfolk filed into the little church. Word of the hasty wedding had spread quickly through San Miguel, drawing curious onlookers who whispered behind raised hands. The simple wooden pews filled with people eager to witness the unexpected union of the quiet carpenter and the rancher's wayward daughter. Donald stood at the altar, his back rigid with pain beneath his cleanest work shirt. The preacher had helped him change the bandages, but every movement still brought fresh agony. Yet his face remained calm, his eyes steady as he waited. Amanda entered through the rear doors, wearing the same dusty dress from yesterday, now partially hidden beneath a borrowed cream-colored shawl from the preacher's wife. The delicate lace couldn't quite hide how her hands trembled. She walked alone down the short aisle, her family already seated in the front pew, their faces set in stern disapproval. Silas Wainwright sat straight back beside his wife Ruth, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Amanda's brothers flanked their parents, arms crossed, their expressions dark with barely contained anger. Not one of them rose to escort Amanda to the altar. The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the worn floorboards as Amanda took her place beside Donald. She kept her eyes lowered, her fingers working nervously at the edge of the borrowed shawl. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat and opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying a hint of reluctance, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God." The ceremony proceeded with stark simplicity. No music played, no flowers adorned the altar, and no rings were exchanged. There hadn't been time to procure any. When the moment came for their vows, Donald's quiet voice filled the church with steady conviction. "I, Donald Stoltzfus, take thee, Amanda Wainwright, to be my wedded wife." His Pennsylvania Dutch accent wrapped around the traditional words, giving them an otherworldly quality in the frontier church. Amanda's response came in whispers, barely audible beyond the first row. Her voice gained strength only when she spoke Donald's name, as if drawing courage from its solid sound. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Thomas concluded, "I now pronounce you man and wife." He paused, then added softly, "You may kiss your bride." Donald gently took Amanda's hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles instead of claiming a proper kiss. A murmur rippled through the assembled townsfolk at this understated gesture. As they turned to face the congregation, the whispers grew louder. "Scandalous affair," someone muttered. "Poor Wainwright family," came another voice. "Forced to marry her off to that strange Amish fellow." Donald guided Amanda down the aisle, his large hand steady at her elbow. Her family remained seated as they passed, Silas's face like stone, Ruth's eyes brimming with unshed tears. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the church steps as more townspeople gathered to stare and speculate. Instead of turning toward the Wainwright Ranch Road, Donald led Amanda along the quieter streets toward the edge of town. His workshop cabin stood apart from the other buildings, a modest structure with a small vegetable patch beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone, likely the preacher's wife, had thoughtfully started a fire within. Donald opened the rough-hewn door, stepping back to let Amanda enter first. She paused on the threshold, taking in the simple space. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, shelves lined with woodworking tools, a table with 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. Finished chairs and tables stood against one wall, their surfaces gleaming with careful craftsmanship. "It's not much," Donald said softly, "but you'll be safe here." He moved carefully to the stove, his injuries evident in each measured step. "I know this isn't what you chose. I won't force any closeness upon you." Amanda clutched the borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. As evening settled over the cabin, Donald warmed a simple supper of cornbread and beans. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crack of the small fire and the scrape of spoons against tin plates. Amanda kept her eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the hearth, while Donald sat stiffly across the table, each movement carefully controlled to avoid pulling at his bandaged back. The fire cast flickering shadows on the cabin walls. As they finished their meal, 2 strangers bound together by duty and circumstance, sharing their first quiet evening as husband and wife. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold. Despite the persistent ache in his back, Donald eased himself from the narrow cot he'd made up on the workshop floor. He'd insisted Amanda take the bed, separated by a hanging quilt, that divided the cabin's single room. The familiar scent of wood shavings welcomed him as he lifted his plane from its rack. His movements were stiff, each twist sending fresh pain through his bandaged back, but the routine of woodworking called to him like a healing balm. The steady scrape of steel against pine filled the quiet morning air. Amanda stirred at the sound, blinking in the early light that filtered through the cabin's single window. She found Donald already absorbed in his work, carefully shaping boards that would become a cupboard. Sawdust dusted his shoulders, catching the sunlight like tiny stars. "Every proper home needs a cupboard," he muttered, not looking up from his work. "For your things." The simple thoughtfulness of his words caught Amanda off guard. She moved to the iron stove, adding kindling and striking a match. Soon, the familiar scent of cooking oatmeal filled the cabin. When she shyly placed a bowl before Donald, he set down his tools and bowed his head in silent prayer. They ate in quiet until Amanda's voice broke the morning stillness. I suppose you deserve to know why I ran." Her spoon stirred. Endless circles in her oatmeal. "Why you had to take those lashes." Donald's eyes met hers across the rough-hewn table, patient and steady. "My father," Amanda's voice wavered. "He arranged for me to marry Elias Finch." Donald's expression darkened slightly at the name. Everyone in San Miguel knew of the cattle baron's reputation. "Finch wanted our water rights," Amanda continued, her words coming faster now. "And the dowry father promised. But I'd seen how he treats people. His ranch hands, the townfolk, anyone who stands in his way." Her hands trembled around her tin cup. I couldn't bear to be bound to such brutality." Donald nodded gravely, understanding filling his weathered features. "Sometimes," he said softly, "running is the only way to stay true to what's right." Amanda looked up, surprised by the pain in his voice. "I left my own people," Donald continued, his Pennsylvania Dutch accent thickening with emotion. "During the war, they wanted me to fight, to take up arms, but I couldn't. The elders said I brought shame to the order." His calloused fingers traced the grain of the wooden table. "Lost my family, my faith community, everything I knew." "How do you bear it?" Amanda whispered. "The loneliness?" "I remember that God's mercy is wider than man's judgment." Donald's voice was gentle. "And I try to build beautiful things, useful things. It helps." The morning stretched into afternoon as they settled into their separate labors. Donald returned to his woodworking, the rhythmic sounds of saw and plane filling the air. Amanda found purpose in setting the cabin to rights, sweeping away sawdust, arranging Donald's few possessions with care. As evening approached, Amanda stepped outside, drawn by the spectacular colors painting the western sky. The setting sun set the mountains ablaze with amber and purple light. She wrapped her arms around herself, drinking in the wild beauty of the landscape. Footsteps crunched softly behind her. Donald emerged from his workshop, wiping his hands on his apron. He stood beside her, far enough to be proper, close enough to share the moment. "God paints each day new," he remarked quietly, his eyes on the horizon. "No two sunsets ever quite the same." Amanda glanced at him, seeing not the strange outsider the town whispered about, but a man who had sacrificed everything for his principles, who had taken her lashes without hesitation, who was now building her a cupboard simply because he thought she should have one. The sky continued its magnificent display, but Amanda found herself watching Donald instead. His profile was peaceful in the fading light, and for the first time since fleeing her father's house, she felt something like hope stir in her heart. A fragile trust, as delicate as the evening's first star, began to bloom between them as they stood together, watching darkness gather in the valley below. Sunday dawned clear and crisp over San Miguel. Amanda stood before the cabin's small mirror, adjusting her borrowed shawl with nervous fingers. Donald appeared behind her, his movements still careful from his healing wounds. "We should attend service," he said quietly. Amanda's hand stilled. "The whispers," she began. "Will always be there," Donald finished, his voice gentle but firm. "But we face them together now." They walked slowly down the dusty street toward the white-painted church. Donald's stride was measured, each step a reminder of his still healing back. Amanda matched his pace, aware of curtains twitching in windows as they passed. The church bell tolled its final call as they climbed the wooden steps. Inside, the familiar scent of beeswax candles and old hymnals filled the air. Heads turned as they entered, and whispers rippled through the congregation like wind through prairie grass. Donald guided them to a pew near the back, helping Amanda settle before easing himself down beside her. The preacher's voice rose above the murmurs, strong and clear. "Today we speak of mercy." Amanda felt tears prick her eyes as the sermon unfolded. The preacher's words about new beginnings and God's endless capacity for fresh starts seemed meant especially for them. Donald sat straight-backed beside her, his presence steady as a mountain. After the final hymn, as people began to file out, Donald surprised her by approaching a group of townsfolk. Amanda watched, puzzled, as he spoke quietly with several ranch hands, a widow who lived near the general store, and even motioned to a native family she'd noticed camped at the edge of town. When he returned to her side, his eyes held a gentle light. "I've invited them all for supper," he said. "Supper?" Amanda's voice rose in panic. But the cabin is so small. And I haven't prepared anything, and..." Donald's weathered hand found hers, squeezing softly. "The table may be rough, but it's sturdy, and your stew is better than any I've tasted." The afternoon passed in a flurry of preparation. Amanda kneaded bread while Donald, despite her protests, moved furniture to make space for their guests. As the sun began to set, their visitors arrived. The Apache couple, Chuli and Nalin, entered first, their small son clinging to his mother's skirts. They brought a gift of dried berries, which Nowlin presented with dignified grace. The ranch hands arrived next, caps in hand, followed by Widow Chun with a jar of preserved peaches. Donald had arranged benches and chairs around the work table, now cleared of wood shavings and tools. Lamplight cast a warm glow over the gathering, turning the humble cabin into something almost magical. Amanda ladled stew into mismatched bowls, her initial nervousness fading as conversation filled the small space. Chuli, his English halting but clear, spoke of hunting in the mountains. The ranch hands shared tales of cattle drives, while Widow Chun described her garden's first spring shoots, their son fascinated by Donald's woodworking tools. Nowlin explained, in her native tongue, which Chuli translated, "He says the wood speaks to you, yes? Like our elders say the earth speaks?" Donald nodded, smiling. "Each piece has its own story," he replied, demonstrating with a scrap of pine. "We just help tell it." Before they ate, Donald rose carefully to his feet. The room quieted as he spoke. "At this table, none are strangers." His voice carried the same gentle authority it had when he'd stepped forward to take Amanda's punishment. "We are all God's children, seeking bread and fellowship." Amanda, passing the last bowl of stew, paused to survey the scene. Ranch hands sat shoulder to shoulder with the Apache family. Widow Chun showed Nowlin her preserved peach technique using gestures and smiles. Donald's rough table, crafted by his own hands, held them all. Here was a family unlike any she'd known, not bound by blood or tradition, but by simple acceptance and shared bread. The warmth in her chest had nothing to do with the stove's heat. This was what she'd been seeking, perhaps all her life, a place where judgment fell away, where mercy and understanding reigned. As laughter and conversation filled their small cabin, Amanda caught Donald watching her. His eyes held a question, and she answered it with a smile that came from somewhere deep and true within her. This was the life she longed for, not the grand ranch house of her childhood or the cattle baron's mansion she'd fled, but this humble cabin filled with light and welcome. The evening wrapped around them like a well-worn quilt, imperfect but warm, as their unlikely family shared bread and belonging beneath the rising moon. The morning after their shared supper, peace shattered like glass on stone. Hoofbeats thundered down San Miguel's main street, dust billowing behind two riders who reined their horses to a stop before the marshal's office. Silas Wainwright sat tall in his saddle, his face carved from granite. Beside him, Elias Finch's expensive boots hit the wooden walkway with a thud that made passersby flinch. Inside the marshal's office, papers scattered as the door crashed open. Marshal Jenkins looked up from his desk, startled by the intrusion. Silas planted both hands on the scarred wood surface, leaning forward. "That marriage ain't legal," he declared, voice hard as iron. "That Amish outcast coerced my daughter." Elias Finch paced behind him like a caged mountain lion. "Girl was promised to me first," he added, spurs jingling with each step. "Everybody knows it." The marshal rubbed his chin, glancing between the two men. "Marriage certificate signed proper," he said carefully. "Witnessed by Preacher Thompson himself." "She wasn't in her right mind," Silas insisted. "That Stoltzfus took advantage." The door creaked open again. Donald stepped inside, his movements still stiff from his healing wounds. Amanda followed close, behind, her fingers tight on his arm. "That's not true," Donald said quietly. The room fell silent at his calm words. Amanda chose to stay. "Ask her yourself." Elias whirled toward them, his expensive coat swirling. "You think you can just walk in here and steal what's mine?" His hand twitched near his gun belt. That water rights agreement was as good as signed. Amanda stepped forward, though Donald tried to hold her back. "I was never yours to claim, Elias Finch," she said, voice shaking but clear. "Not me, not our water, not our land." Elias's face darkened like a thundercloud. He took a step toward Amanda, but Donald moved between them. Though shorter than the cattle baron, Donald's presence held steady as oak. Threats won't change what's done, Donald said softly. The Lord sees all hearts here. Elias sneered, his handsome features twisting. Your God won't help you when. He caught himself, glancing at the marshal. This ain't over, Stoltzfus. The two men stormed out, leaving papers fluttering in their wake. Amanda sagged against Donald, trembling. They walked home slowly through the whispering town, aware of eyes watching from every window. That evening, flames crackled in their small hearth as Donald and Amanda sat in troubled silence. Shadows danced across the cabin walls, and every creak of the settling wood made Amanda start. I should have told you sooner, she finally whispered, about Elias. Donald set down his carved cup, waiting. He's been trying to buy our water rights. For years, Amanda continued, staring into the fire. When Papa's cattle started dying in the drought, Elias offered a deal, marriage and money both. Her hands twisted in her skirt. But I've seen how he treats his workers, his horses. The cruelty in his eyes, Donald nodded slowly. A man's true nature shows in small things first, he said. He won't stop, Amanda's voice cracked. Everything he wants, he takes. By law or by force. Then we face him with truth, Donald answered, though his heart beat heavy in his chest. He knew his peaceful ways might prove poor shield against Elias's kind of power. Sleep came fitfully that night. Dawn brought bitter frost and worse tidings. Pinned to their cabin door, Donald found 3 notes written in different hands. He read. Then silently, his face growing grave. What do they say? Amanda asked from the doorway. Donald tried to hide them, but she snatched one from his hand. Her face paled as she read the threats, warnings to leave town, accusations of land stealing, dark hints of violence to come. We have to go, Amanda pleaded, gripping his sleeve. He'll kill you, Donald. Just like he did to that farmer who wouldn't sell last spring. Donald shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. Running solves nothing. It only teaches the wicked they can win through fear. He gathered the threatening notes and added them to the morning's kindling. As the paper caught flame, Donald stood straight despite his healing wounds. This is our home now, he said. And I mean to defend it, not with fists or guns, but with truth and patience. Amanda watched the threats turn to ash, her heart torn between terror and admiration. Outside their window, San Miguel stirred to life, unaware of the storm gathering. In its midst, the whisper started at Grayson's blacksmith shop, carried on the rhythmic ring of hammer striking anvil. Donald had come to arrange repairs for his broken wood plane, but the conversations around him stopped as he entered. Men huddled in corners, speaking in low tones that carried too well in the confined space. Ain't his child at all, one ranch hand muttered to another. Remember that drifter she ran off with? The one who left her in Carson City? Donald's hands went still on the wooden handle he'd been examining. The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. That's why her pa was so quick to marry her off, another voice added. Hide the shame before it started showing. The blacksmith shot Donald a look of mingled pity and disgust. Donald set down the plane with careful precision, paid his deposit, and walked out into the crisp autumn air. Each step home felt heavier than the last. The afternoon light slanted golden through their cabin windows as Amanda stirred a pot of beans over the fire. She looked up when Donald entered, her smile fading at his expression. Is something wrong? She asked, setting down her wooden spoon. Donald settled heavily into a chair, his hands clasped before him. I heard talk at the Smiths today, he said. Quietly, about you, about a child. Amanda's face went white as fresh linen. The spoon clattered to the floor, and she gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table to steady herself. I need to know the truth, Donald continued, his voice gentle. Despite the storm in his heart, are you carrying another man's child? Tears welled in Amanda's eyes. She sank into the chair across from him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Yes, she whispered. I was foolish and desperate. He promised to marry me, to take me away from Elias. But when he found out about the baby, he disappeared. Donald sat very still, feeling the foundations of his world shift beneath him. The quiet faith he'd placed in their marriage, though arranged, crumbled like dry earth. "That's why Papa was so eager to marry me off," Amanda continued, words tumbling out between sobs, "to hide the scandal. I wanted to tell you, but I was so afraid." Her voice broke. "Afraid you'd cast me out, like everyone else." Donald stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Without a word, he walked outside into the gathering dusk. The mountain air bit at his face as he stared up at the emerging stars, their cold light offering no answers to the questions tearing at his heart. Behind him, through the cabin's single window, he could hear Amanda weeping by the fire. The sound twisted in his chest like a knife. He had taken lashes for her, married her to protect her honor, and now this truth lay between them like a shadow. The night grew deeper. Donald walked until his legs ached, wrestling with his conscience. His Amish upbringing demanded strict morality, yet Christ's teaching spoke of mercy. When the moon rose high, he finally returned to find Amanda asleep in her chair, tears still damp on her cheeks. The next morning dawned gray and cheerless. Donald rose before sunrise and went straight to his workshop, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of saw and plane. Each stroke of sandpaper against wood helped quiet his troubled thoughts. Amanda brought him dinner, but he couldn't meet her eyes. She set the plate down and lingered, as if wanting to speak, but Donald kept his attention fixed on his work. Finally she turned away, her footsteps heavy with sorrow. In town, the whispers had become open mockery. Donald felt the stares as he walked to the general store, heard the snickers behind his back. "There goes the fool who took another man's trouble," one man said loudly to his companion. "30 lashes for a woman carrying a drifter's bastard," another added. "Must be simpler than we thought." The words stung, but not as sharply as watching Amanda's guilt grow with each passing day. She moved through their cabin like a ghost, her face drawn with shame. Every time she caught sight of the healing scars on Donald's back as he washed, fresh tears would fall. That evening, Donald sat at his workbench, staring at an unfinished cradle he'd begun before hearing the news. The smooth cedar wood seemed to mock his broken dreams. Amanda stood in the workshop doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "You're the only one who's ever shown me real kindness, and I've repaid you with heartbreak." Donald ran his hand over the cradle's curved edge, unable to find words for the turmoil in his heart. The oil lamp cast wavering shadows as Donald's pen scratched across the rough paper. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, each word feeling like another stone laid on his heavy heart. The note was brief, just a few lines explaining his decision to return to Pennsylvania, to the Amish community that had cast him out years ago. He folded the paper carefully, placing it on the kitchen table where Amanda would find it in the morning. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved through the darkened cabin, gathering the few possessions he would need for the long journey east. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountains. Amanda stirred from her cot, the morning chill seeping through her worn quilt. Her eyes fell on the folded paper, and her heart seemed to stop. With shaking fingers, she opened the note, reading Donald's careful script through tears that began to fall before she'd finished the first line. She found him in the workshop, already at his bench though the sun had barely risen. "Please," she whispered, holding up the wrinkled paper, "please don't go." Donald kept sanding the piece of wood in his hands, his movements mechanical. "I have to," he said quietly, still not looking at her. "I cannot raise another man's child, but where will you go?" Amanda's voice cracked. "The Amish, they turned you away. Better to face their judgment than stay here, living a lie." His words fell between them like stones. Amanda's legs gave way, and she sank to the workshop floor, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Donald's hands stilled on his work, but he did not turn. The morning light streamed through the workshop windows, catching the dust motes that danced between them. As evening approached, Donald began packing his tools into a wooden crate, each one wrapped carefully in burlap. The familiar weight of his chisels and planes felt different now, heavier somehow. The sound of his preparations echoed through the cabin like a funeral drum. In the kitchen, Amanda moved like a woman in a dream, gathering ingredients for Donald's favorite stew, the one with wild mushrooms and garden vegetables she'd learned to make just weeks ago. The knife trembled in her hand as she chopped carrots, tears falling silently into the pot. The aroma of the cooking stew filled the cabin, but when Amanda ladled it into Donald's bowl, he barely touched it. They sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table, the silence between them as vast as the prairie itself. "The stage to Denver leaves in 2 days," Donald said finally, his voice low. "I've arranged passage." Amanda stared at her untouched bowl, her fingers tracing the wooden grain of the table he had crafted. 2 days, she repeated, the words hollow. After supper, Donald returned to his packing while Amanda cleared the dishes with mechanical movements. The lamp burned low as night settled over the cabin. Through the thin walls, Donald could hear Amanda's footsteps as she paced, then the soft thud of knees hitting the floor beside her cot. "Dear God," Amanda's whispered prayer carried through the quiet cabin. "I know I haven't spoken to you in years, not since," her voice broke. "But please, please don't let him leave. I know I don't deserve his kindness, but—" The prayer dissolved into quiet sobs. Donald stood in the workshop doorway, his heart twisting at the sound of her broken words. It was the first time he'd heard her pray since their hasty marriage, and the raw desperation in her voice made his resolution waver for a moment. But the memory of the townspeople's mockery strengthened his resolve. He couldn't stay, couldn't face the daily reminder of her deception, couldn't raise a child born of another man's betrayal. Even if it meant returning to a community that had rejected him, even if it meant facing their cold shoulders and stern judgments, it would be better than this hollow shame. He turned back to his crate of tools, checking each one's wrapping one final time. The familiar handles seemed to accuse him, these implements of building and creating, now being used to tear apart the fragile life they had begun to build together. Amanda's prayers continued long into the night, a quiet litany of regret and pleading that followed Donald into his troubled dreams. The mountain wind keened outside their cabin walls, as if nature itself mourned the breaking of their bond. The last night before, Donald's planned departure settled heavy over the cabin like a winter blanket. Outside, an owl called mournfully through the darkness, while inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Donald sat in his chair, staring into the flames, his packed belongings a silent accusation. By the door, Amanda stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands twisting her apron. The ticking of the mantel clock seemed to count down their final hours together. She drew in a shaky breath, gathering every scrap of courage she possessed. "Donald," she said softly, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to say." He didn't turn, but his shoulders tensed at the sound of her voice. Amanda moved closer, her feet whispering across the wooden floor. Tears began rolling down her cheeks, but she forced herself to continue. "You didn't take lashes for a pure woman," she said, her words catching in her throat. "You took them for a broken one." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "That's why I believe God sent you." Donald's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney as Amanda's words hung in the air between them. "When you stepped forward that day," she continued, "no one had ever shown me such mercy. Not my father, not the town, and certainly not Elias." Her voice grew stronger. "I'll stand beside you, Donald. Even against my father. Even against the whole town if I must." Finally, Donald turned to look at her. The firelight caught the wetness in his eyes, revealing the struggle within. "How?" He whispered hoarsely, "How can you ask me to stay?" Amanda knelt beside his chair, her hands clasped in her lap. "Because you know what it means to be cast out, to make mistakes and pray for grace." She reached out tentatively, touching his hand. "Just as your people turned away from you for following your conscience during the war, my family turned from me in my darkest hour." Donald's breath caught. The mention of his exile from the Amish community struck deep, awakening memories of lonely nights and questioning prayers. His fingers unconsciously curled around hers. "Tell me," he said softly. "Tell me everything." Amanda pulled her chair closer to the fire, and as the night deepened, they began to share their burdens. Donald spoke of the day he refused to take up arms, of the elders' disappointment, of walking away from everything he'd ever known. His voice grew rough as he described years of wandering, searching for purpose. "I still dream of home," he admitted, stoking the fire. "Of Sunday gatherings and barn raisings, of belonging." Amanda listened, her heart aching for his loss. When her turn came, she spoke of Elias Finch's growing obsession with her family's land, of her father's blindness to the man's true nature. Her voice shook as she described Elias's threatening gestures, his possessive words, the fear that drove her to flee. "I thought I could escape," she whispered. "I trusted someone who promised help but brought only shame. When I discovered I was with child," she pressed her hands to her face, "I had nowhere to turn." The fire burned low as they talked, their shadows merging on the cabin wall. Outside, the owl fell silent, and the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Donald stood and walked to the window, watching the stars fade. "I've been a fool," he said quietly. "Running away again, just as I did before." He turned to face Amanda, his expression resolved. "No more running, we'll face whatever comes together." Amanda rose, hope dawning in her heart. "You'll stay?" Donald nodded slowly. "I'll stay, not because it's easy, but because it's right." He moved to his packed crate and began unwrapping his tools. "God didn't give me these hands to build walls, but to build bridges." Amanda watched as he carefully returned each tool to its proper place on the workshop wall. The rising sun streamed through the window, painting everything in golden light. In that moment, something shifted between them, no longer just a marriage of convenience, but a partnership forged in shared pain and understanding. "We'll talk," Amanda said softly. "Father will be furious." "And Elias, let them talk," Donald replied, his quiet voice firm with newfound strength. "We'll face their judgment together." He hung his favorite plane on its peg, his movements deliberate. Perhaps that's what God intended all along. Two broken people helping each other become whole. As the sun rose fully over the mountains, its light filled their small cabin with warmth. The packed bags by the door no longer loomed like threats, but stood as reminders of a choice not taken, a despair overcome by courage and truth. The church bell's deep tone echoed through San Miguel, calling townsfolk to the hastily arranged hearing. Its bronze voice rang across dusty streets and weathered storefronts, drawing people from their morning routines. The town hall, usually reserved for council meetings, filled quickly with muttering residents eager to witness the scandal's resolution. Marshall Thompson sat at the head table, his weather-beaten face stern beneath his gray mustache. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of the assembled crowd. Silas Wainwright stood near the front, his bearing proud despite the whispers that followed his family name. Beside him, Elias Finch's dark presence loomed like a thundercloud. Their boots left muddy prints on the plank floor as they approached. The marshal's table. Donald and Amanda entered last, her hand trembling on his arm. They took their places on the opposite side, facing their accusers. Amanda's face was pale but composed, though her fingers worried the edge of her shawl. Donald stood straight despite his healing back, his quiet dignity a sharp contrast to Elias's bristling anger. "This hearing will come to order," Marshal Thompson announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He banged his gavel once, the sharp crack silencing the room. "We're here to address serious accusations regarding the marriage of Donald Stoltzfus and Amanda Wainwright." Silas stepped forward first, his voice carrying to the rafters. "This marriage is built on lies," he declared. "This, Carpenter, took advantage of my daughter's vulnerable state. We demand it be annulled immediately." Elias joined in, his words dripping with venom. "Stoltzfus is nothing but a fraud. He married her for the land, for the water rights. He's made a mockery of proper society." The crowd stirred, whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Amanda looked at Donald, drew a deep breath, and stepped forward. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she moved to address the marshal. "If anyone should speak truth here," she said, her voice starting soft but growing stronger, "it should be me." She turned to face the assembled townspeople, her chin lifted. "I have brought shame to my family, that is true. But not because of Donald." A hush fell over the hall. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath outside the windows. "I am with child," Amanda continued, her words clear and steady despite her trembling hands. "But the child is not Donald's. When I fled my arranged marriage to Elias Finch, I made choices born of desperation and fear." She paused, gathering strength. "Donald knew nothing of this when he took my lashes in the square. He married me not for land or water rights, but out of pure Christian charity." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Silas's face darkened with rage, while Elias's hand clenched into a fist at his side. Donald rose slowly from his seat, moving to stand beside Amanda. He said nothing, but his presence spoke volumes. Suddenly, movement near the back of the hall drew all eyes. Shuley and Nallen, the Apache couple Donald had welcomed to his table weeks before, stood up. Nallen held their small son close as Shuley stepped into the center aisle. "We speak for Donald Stoltzfus," Shuley announced in careful English. His dignified bearing commanded attention despite the prejudiced murmurs that arose. "This man help us when others turn away," Nallen nodded, adding her voice. "He show us how to file papers at land office. Legal papers for our spring water." She met Elias's glare without flinching. "Papers that stop others from stealing what is ours." Understanding dawned on faces throughout the hall. Elias's attempt to seize the Apache family's water rights was well known, though few had dared speak of it. His face turned purple with rage. "You dare bring these savages to testify?" Elias roared, taking a threatening step forward. "This is an outrage. Silence!" Marshal Thompson's gavel crashed down. The sharp report echoed off the walls as he fixed Elias with a steely glare. "These folks have as much right to speak as any here. Their words carry weight with this court." The marshal's stern voice restored order, though tension still crackled through the air like heat lightning. Donald remained standing beside Amanda, his quiet strength unchanged by the drama unfolding around them. The afternoon light slanted lower through the windows, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor as the town waited for justice to be served. Marshal Thompson cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. His weathered hands rested flat on the wooden table before him as he surveyed the crowded hall. "Having heard all testimony," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner, "I find the marriage between Donald Stoltzfus and Amanda Wainwright to be lawful and binding." He fixed Silas with a stern look. "No evidence of coercion or fraud has been presented. Rather, we've seen proof of Mr. Stoltzfus's good character and Mrs. Stoltzfus's free choice in this matter." The gavel struck wood with finality. "This marriage will stand." Elias Finch's face twisted with rage. He spun toward the door, his spurs jingling against the floorboards. At the threshold, he turned back, his voice thick with hate. "This town ain't worth my time no more," he spat. Y'all can rot with your precious carpenter and his soiled bride." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The sound of hoofbeats soon faded as he galloped away. Silas Wainwright stood rigid, his pride warring with defeat. Without a word, he turned and walked out, leaving Amanda and Donald standing together in the golden afternoon light. The townspeople filed out slowly, many pausing to nod respectfully to Donald. Some even touched Amanda's arm gently, offering quiet words of support. The Apache family approached last, Shuli extending his hand to Donald. "You show truth," he said simply. "We not forget." Amanda leaned against Donald's arm, her strength finally failing as relief flooded through her. He supported her carefully, leading her out into the cooling evening air. They walked home in comfortable silence, the setting sun painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Their cabin looked different, somehow more welcoming, more like home. But before they could retreat inside, wagon wheels creaked on the road. Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, appeared with a fresh apple pie. Behind her came the Williams family, carrying a patchwork quilt. More neighbors followed, their arms full of gifts and good wishes. Soon their small cabin overflowed with warmth and welcome. "Land's sakes, child," Mrs. Miller said, hugging Amanda. "You've had quite a journey. But you're home now." Donald stood near his workbench, clearly overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. His quiet, "Thank you," spoke volumes, though his eyes grew suspiciously bright. Amanda moved among their guests, tears flowing freely as she accepted each gift and embrace. The widow Thompson brought bread still warm from her oven. "Every home needs fresh bread," she declared, pressing it into Amanda's hands. "And every marriage needs neighbors to lean on." As darkness fell, lanterns glowed in the windows. Their table groaned under plates of food, while conversation and laughter filled every corner. Children played with wooden tops Donald had carved, while women shared recipes and men discussed the spring planting. Gradually, the visitors departed, leaving behind a cabin transformed. Quilts brightened the bed, curtains softened the windows, and the cupboard Donald had built held new dishes and cooking tools. When the last guest had gone, Donald and Amanda stood in their doorway, watching stars appear above the mountains. The night air carried the scent of pine and sage, clean and fresh with promise. Donald turned to Amanda, taking her hand in his. His voice was soft but sure. "I promise you more than just shelter," he said. "You'll have dignity here, and respect. Not because duty demands it, but because you deserve it." Amanda's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the bitter ones she'd shed before. "You gave me that already," she whispered, "when you stood between me and the whip." Donald drew her closer, his touch gentle. For the first time, they embraced not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners beginning to understand love's deeper meaning. Amanda rested her head against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady. The cabin behind them glowed with lamplight, filled now with gifts of welcome instead of whispered scandal. Through the window, they could see the new quilt draped across their bed, its patterns a reminder of the community that had finally embraced them. They stood together in the doorway of their home, their shadows merging in the starlight, while crickets sang in the sage and an owl called softly from the pine trees. The night wrapped around them like a blessing, full of peace and possibility. The weeks slipped past like snow melting on window panes. December wrapped San Miguel in white silence, broken only by the scrape of Donald's woodworking tools and the soft humming of Amanda's voice as she sewed in their cabin. Donald crafted cradles with careful hands, each stroke of sandpaper smoothing hope into the wood. His latest piece stood near completion, a sturdy cradle of cherry wood, its curves gentle as a mother's arms. Beside it lay half-finished cupboards, their doors carved with simple, flowing designs that spoke of his Amish heritage. Amanda sat in the chair Donald had made her, letting her sewing rest in her lap. Her pregnancy showed clearly now, rounding her dress. Sometimes she caught Donald watching her with a tender look that made her heart flutter. These quiet days held a peace she had never known at her father's ranch. One crisp morning, sleigh bells jingled outside their door. Amanda looked up from her mending to find her mother, Ruth, standing in the doorway, snow dusting her heavy wool coat. "Mama?" Amanda whispered, hardly daring to believe. Ruth's eyes were warm with unshed tears. "I had to come," she said softly. "I had to see you." Donald appeared from his workshop, sawdust coating his apron. Without hesitation, he pulled out a chair near the fire. "You're welcome here, Mrs. Wainwright." Ruth settled into the offered seat, her hands trembling as she removed her gloves. "I was wrong about you, Donald," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. I've seen how you treat my daughter, how you've given her dignity and peace." Amanda knelt beside her mother's chair, taking Ruth's cold hands in hers. Tears spilled down both their cheeks as Ruth touched Amanda's rounded belly with gentle fingers. Might I come again?" Ruth asked hesitantly. "When the baby comes?" "Oh, Mama," Amanda sobbed, clutching her mother's hands tighter. "Yes, please, yes." Donald moved quietly in the background, brewing coffee and setting out plates. Soon, the small table held a simple supper of bread, stew, and pie. They ate together, the fire crackling companionably in the hearth, while outside snow fell soft as mercy. Later, after Ruth had gone, Donald and Amanda lay in their bed, talking in whispers about the future. The moonlight painted silver patterns on their quilt as they spoke of raising the child together. "I never thought I could have this," Amanda murmured, her hand resting on her belly. "Such peace, such acceptance." Donald's hand covered hers, warm and steady. "God grants grace in unexpected ways," he replied softly. "Through unexpected people." The Colorado spring arrived like a gentle awakening. Snowmelt trickled down from the peaks, feeding streams that would soon burst with life. Inside their cabin, Donald sat in the rocking chair he had crafted months ago, its smooth motion soothing the tiny bundle in his arms. The wood creaked softly beneath him, a sound as familiar now as his own heartbeat. Amanda worked nearby at her sewing table, lamplight casting a warm glow on her peaceful face. Her needle dipped and rose in steady rhythm, matching the cadence of Donald's rocking. Their baby girl, just 6 weeks old, slept soundly, her tiny fingers curled into fists against the soft blanket Ruth had quilted for her. Donald gazed at his daughter's face, marveling at how naturally love had grown in his heart. The fears that had once threatened to drive him away seemed distant now, like storm clouds long past. This child, born of another man's sin, had become his own through the quiet miracle of choosing love over judgment. Amanda paused in her sewing, lifting her head as voices drifted through the cabin walls. The sound grew clearer, singing, pure and strong, rising from outside their door. She recognized the melody of Amazing Grace, carried on multiple voices. Donald stood carefully, cradling the sleeping infant. Amanda set aside her work and joined him, her hand finding his arm as they moved toward the door. Together, they stepped onto their small porch into the golden light of sunset. Their yard was filled with people. Ranch hands from neighboring spreads stood shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk. The preacher raised his voice in harmony with the widow who brought them bread each week. Near the garden fence, Chuli and Nalin, the Apache couple, held their young son between them as they joined the hymn. Their presence spoke volumes about the bridges of trust built over shared meals and simple kindness. The mountains blazed with evening light, painting the scene in hues of amber and rose. The hymn swelled in the clear air, each voice adding to its strength. Amanda's eyes filled with tears as she recognized her mother Ruth among the singers, standing proud and tall, her face glowing with grandmother's joy. Donald shifted the baby gently in his arms, drawing Amanda closer to his side. Burdens borne together are lighter, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. God knew what he was about when he brought us together. Amanda leaned into his strength, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as she smiled. From shame to blessing, she murmured, touching their daughter's soft cheek. Who could have imagined such grace? The setting sun painted long shadows across their cabin's weathered boards, but warmth spilled from every window. Inside, the fire crackled in welcome, and the table stood ready for guests, a habit of hospitality that had transformed their home into a gathering place for all who sought belonging. The hymn drew to a close, its final notes carried away on the evening breeze. But the people remained, drawn together by something stronger than the old barriers of culture and circumstance. Ranch hands chatted easily with townspeople while children played at their feet. Nalin shared her woven blankets with admiring women, and Chuli discussed spring planting with weathered farmers. Donald and Amanda's cabin glowed like a beacon in the gathering dusk, its light spilling out to embrace them all. Here stood the truth that had been growing all along, a family made whole not by blood or obligation, but by choice and faith and love. The town that had once buzzed with scandal now hummed with harmony, proving that mercy could transform not just two hearts, but an entire community. Their daughter stirred in her sleep, making small sounds of contentment. Amanda touched the baby's hand, marveling at its perfect fingers. Donald pressed a kiss to Amanda's temple, his silent gesture speaking volumes about the journey that had brought them here, from wounded strangers to healing hearts to family, bound by something deeper than circumstance. Together they stood, framed in the doorway of their home, while around them their chosen family gathered in celebration of love's power to redeem. The mountains stood witness, their eternal faces catching the day's last light, as if heaven itself smiled upon the scene. A family made whole, a community united, and grace abundant as the spring that flowed from the heights above. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.